Hi, everyone. My name is Betsy Cooper, and I'm from the Aspen Tech Policy Hub. And I'm extremely excited to be hosting this conversation today on data privacy and how companies are using your data. This is a moment in data privacy. Frequent hacks are making us feel more vulnerable, ransomware is getting more and more widespread, and given the COVID-19 pandemic, we are online more than ever. I'm very excited to have an amazing conversation today with two experts in this space. First is Bruce Schneier, internationally renowned security technologist, the author of 14 books on these issues, and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. He will be joined by Tom Wilson, Chair, President, and CEO of Allstate Corporation. But we'd love to have this conversation not just be at you, but with you. So let's kick this off with a little poll. Do you believe businesses are doing enough to help consumers control your data? The poll should pop up momentarily, and we'd love to see your answers. So use the Slido box in the right of the video player. Please click your answer, and then we'll be able to see the results.
Bruce, how did you vote?
It's an odd question. Like, what does doing enough mean? Enough by what metric? Businesses are sort of by definition making profit off of you. So why, unless they're in the business of doing it, Google's goal is to get your data. Their goal is not to protect it. So I don't even know how to parse the question. It's hard.
Well, we do have the answer.
I'm just a yes or no person.
What did you say, Tom? Yes or no?
I think no, but
great. Well, we have 11% yes. Right. We have 11% yes and 75% no. So most people are agreeing with Tom. It looks like there were some, though, who questioned the question like Bruce. So can you talk to us a little bit about the current relationship between corporations and consumers when it comes to consumer data? So who has the control in your opinion, and has it always been like this?
So who did you direct that question to? You dropped out for me for a second.
Oh, sorry, Bruce, that was to you.
Okay, so corporations have control. The way it works, certainly in the US, is that data is owned by the collector. So data about you, about me, about everybody is owned by the Googles and the Facebooks and everybody else who collects it. So it is their data, and they can do whatever they want with it, right? They can buy it, they can sell it, they can aggregate it with other data, they could use it to further your interests, they could use it against your interests, they often use it against your interests. But data is not owned by you. You kind of think it is because it's about you, but it's owned by the company that collects it. And that is an odd way of building the world, but that's what we got.
Awesome. And, you've described before this sort of corporate data collection as surveillance. And normally when I think of surveillance, I think of governments doing surveillance, not companies. So how has this changed? What do you think surveillance means today? And has the internet changed the way that we think about surveillance?
So surveillance means what it's always meant, right? Being followed. So nothing in the dictionary says governance, right? You can surveil your sister. I used to do it all the time. So what's changing, of course, is how easy it is. Everything we're doing is mediated online. This is the most effective surveillance device ever invented. Right? It knows where you are at all times. It knows where you live, where you work, when you wake up, when you go to sleep. Everyone has one. It knows who you sleep with. Right? It knows what you do, what you say. Right? And no one says, I'm going to put my surveillance device in my pocket. I'm going to grab my phone. So just the fact that everything we do on computers generates a record of what happened. And over the years, the cost of collecting and saving that has dropped so cheap. So now, right, the companies that you are working with on this phone are collecting all of that data. And they're using it. So that's what's changed. What's changed is the cost of collection, cost of correlation, cost of use. That's really dropped to free.
One more follow-up, which is, do you think people understand that? Now that people are online as much as they have been during the pandemic, has there been any change in the way that the average consumer perceives this sort of data collection?
I think most people do understand, like, that Facebook is spying on them, that's why it's free. Google is spying on them, that's why it's free. I think people tend to feel powerless about it. We need to connect. We need to search. We need to talk to our friends. We need to use these services. Right? You can't be a fully functioning human being in the 21st century without a phone. And while we do know that Google Maps works because everybody using Google Maps is under surveillance, right? That's how it knows how the traffic is moving. We are forced to accept it, and we largely don't think about it. When you ask consumers, they understand it, but they feel powerless. And in fact, in a lot of cases, they are powerless.
And so, Tom, I'd love to, get the perspective of how you're thinking about these things from a market perspective. So tell us how Allstate thinks about consumer data and who has control over it. For instance, how do you manage programs like DriveWise, which gives people lower rates for safe driving? There's a lot of data that goes into a program like that.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Bruce said, is that I don't know if I like the word surveillance as much, because people sort of agreed to be surveilled. So in DriveWise, you get a cheaper price if you're a better driver, if you let us track your car. But we're tracking 26 million cars a day. We have a digital footprint product that it'll tell you what your digital footprint is. Average person, 350 online accounts. So we've made so many trades, we don't even know who's tracking us. So I completely agree that everything you've done. And I think that was necessary at the beginning. So if you just look at where we are with this sort of digital economy, having free data, free raw material worked at the beginning, and it let all this data get accumulated together. I think we're at an inflection point, though. Consumers do feel trapped, like they don't think they can live with it or without it. They're at risk. Everybody's concerned what people are doing with the data. So I think we should change. I think we need to change it, and we need to start changing it now, because we just keep building up, this is not like wine. A problem like this doesn't age well. And so I think we need to do two things. I think we need to change the copyright laws and give people ownership of their data. And we should standardize data agreements. I think there's a whole bunch of other stuff that has to be done, antitrust laws and all this other stuff. But I think if we don't start and get the market to help drive the change, which is giving people control, then we won't get anywhere.
I want to ask a follow-up to that, but first, Bruce, any reactions to those policy ideas, copyright data agreements? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm in favor of those. I think antitrust I would put that even higher, because I think the monopolies are doing a lot of damage, but Tom's right. And if you remember the early days of the internet, what Tom said, there was no way to charge micropayments. You couldn't actually charge a small amount for a news article or for a feed. You can today. Between PayPal and even the credit cards, you can do micropayments now. So back then, the advertising model was the only possible model we had. And that turned into personalized advertising, which turned into surveillance. Now there actually are other models that can work. We're not stuck with advertising or surveillance as the business model of the internet.
But what I'd like to see happen would be take that micropayments model, give people ownership of their data with the copyright laws, and then you have 4 standard agreements. The most aggressive would be open, which is what it is today, but then Google would have to pay me if I do open. If I chose the most restrictive, they might say you got to pay me something to use me. So I think you could create a market economy, because there's basically Google and Facebook have no cost to their raw material. It's free.
I'm less excited about that. You do the math, and your data to Facebook is worth about like $8 a year. It's actually kind of lousy. It's only valuable in aggregate. I kind of like the European model, which is the rights-based model for privacy, and not the commerce-based model. Right? So in the U.S., it's illegal to sell your kidney. We have decided that is an immoral market, and we're not going to allow it. And I think a kind of a rights-based model for your privacy is going to work better, because the commerce seems to fail because to each individual person, it's almost nothing. It's only valuable in aggregate, which is why
I don't know if I agree with that.
So powerful.
Google and Facebook, just those 2 companies, their revenue per household is $2,000 a household a year. So I'm like, I don't know where the $8 comes from. It could be right, but I'm just like, there's huge amounts of money made here. And what happens when you
my
don't pay
data is
for
a
it?
few years old. I forget where I got it. It was in my book, and I used it. I
Yeah,
can't remember where it came from.
well, whatever it is, if you don't pay for it, you don't value it. So what happens is companies collect as much data as they can. Axiom has got, I think it's like we buy a bunch of data because we live on data. They've got 11,000 attributes on 2.5 billion people. They paid zero for that.
So let me dig into that, Tom, because one of the reasons that it is so hard to solve this problem is that, as you just said, companies that aren't the platforms are reliant on data to do their business well. Is that inevitable? You just said that data is a core of what you're doing. Is that the way of the future, such that the only way to resolve this problem is to assume that your data is going to be owned by somebody and you have to get compensated for it, as opposed to allowing somebody to say, actually, no, I don't want these companies to have access to my data, period?
Well, I think if you change the ownership model that Bruce started with from the company to the individual, then you have 310 million Americans fighting Google, Facebook, and everybody else. In addition to, if you think there's antitrust laws or whatever else, like, the antitrust laws, maybe they'll get changed. Facebook just won something, and they clearly have a lot of power. I mean, I'm struck when they talk about their oversight board and they say it's like the Supreme Court. I'm like, whoa, that you're thinking about power. It's like, like what president wouldn't like to be able to appoint and ignore the Supreme Court? And so they got a lot of power, but I don't think just the government can take them on. I think we got to turn loose all Americans and give them ownership of their data, make people pay for it. It'll change the business models dramatically. I don't really know how, but I know the current one doesn't work as where Bruce started.
I also want to see limits on the use of data. And so, Tom, you're in insurance, and there's things you can and can't do. Where you can discriminate me based on my age. I think based on my gender. You cannot discriminate on me based on my race. So there are rules of what kind of data you can use for what. And I think that's really interesting. Mostly on the internet, there are no rules. So those kind of rules of what sorts of data discrimination we think are moral and ethical and which we think are anathema, I think will be helpful here as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, which is, and it should be done, right? Like, let's take your face. So the police departments have half the faces in America digitized. And so you're like, whoa, okay, so do you own your face? Well, let's suppose in some future years, my parents decided they didn't think my genes were I was going to be good looking enough, but they wanted me to look like Brad Pitt. Could they take Brad Pitt's picture off there and make me Brad Pitt? Like, you should own your face. Like, why should that be something to people in the airport? So I do think we need rules around how we're going to use so much data, because it's everywhere these days.
So I want to pull a couple threads. So first, Tom, I want to ask, do you think if we were sitting in a round table with a bunch of CEOs, do you think your colleagues would agree with you on these points, or are you in a different place than many of them?
Well, I think I would split it into those people who are data accumulators and those people who are data users. And there'd be a range in there. I would say, I think the data accumulators, the Googles, the Facebooks, Amazons, should want this, because something's going to happen. Like, if you look at history, whether it's railroads, oil companies, when companies get too much power, the government changes. And so you might as well be in the conversation rather than be the meal. And so I think they should embrace something that starts to give power back to people. But I think cutting down the use of data too much, we've all benefited from the use of data. You just think about all the medical breakthroughs and everything, because all this data is out there. So, and that's what they argue, but I think they should embrace it.
Some of it is data within context, not of context. So you're going to use data. I mean, actuarial data is valuable to you. So you'll use data about things that happen in your business to inform pricing of your future business. That makes a lot of sense. Or Amazon shows me books I might want to buy based on books I bought. I think it's when data starts being pulled out of context, when you're browsing, when you're reading the newspaper and you see an ad for something you looked for 2 days ago on the internet.
Right.
And how do they know that? And that's that market. I think people tend to be okay with data being used in the silo in which it's collected. If Fitbit has my data and they're using that for health things, that makes sense. My doctor has my data, using it for medical things, that makes sense.
Well, I think that's where you could standardize the what I would call, they're not privacy agreements. Okay, it is anything but privacy. It's like a misnomer to call it a privacy statement. It's really a data access agreement. And I think you could have 4 of them, right? So you could have guest. Guest is whatever I do right now, that's it. It goes away. You can't collect it. You can't use something else with it. Could be private, just you and me, like interacting. You can't sell it to them. Could be you can anonymize it. Or then it could be what it is today, which is open. Like Apple's iTunes thing, this is a couple of years ago, their privacy statement was 20,000 words long. If you added up all that, I saw this, I read this someplace.
That's a quarter of one of my books.
Yeah, it's longer than Macbeth. Yeah, and if you read, it would take you 76 hours to read all the privacy agreements that you click on in a year. 2 weeks worth of work, and of course they come at the most inopportune time when it's like you're trying to click through. And so I think if you could standardize them, I also think that would be in the big tech's best interest, because you wouldn't have all these state laws out there. So, and then what you could do is I would say, like, I really trust Bruce. I'm willing to go open. I think he's my medical provider. He's going to use it to help people that have all kinds of medical issues. But no, I'm thinking, Action Auto. I'm a guest. I'm checking like the price of a tire, and we're done. So if you could standardize it, it would eliminate some of that confusion Bruce was talking about, which is people feel, lost.
Well, so let me jump in, because I think you're actually saying 2 things. So first, that there should be a standardized agreement, but then also it should be written in plain language so that somebody actually understands what it means. I guarantee you those 20,000 words were not as easy to read as Bruce's books. They were probably in some pretty deep legalese, and that makes it very hard for people to understand what's happening as well. But so, Bruce, a few minutes ago, you mentioned sort of bias and, how different discriminatory actions can happen. And I'd break that down. The data can be biased, so that can lead you to get a different recommendation than somebody who lives in a city or who is of a different race. But then also the algorithms that are interpreting it can be biased. How do you think consumers should think about those things? Does it matter that there's different sources of bias that may be occurring from a consumer perspective, or really should we just be focused on the data itself?
So I don't want to take consumer perspective. Let's take citizen perspective, human perspective. The focus on consumers, economics, value is just a small piece. This is how we treat human beings in our society. And yes, when things are discriminatory, that is an inequity that we should be concerned about. And whether it's as simple as the credit card offers you see are different than the ones that someone else sees because of data about you. Are we okay about that or not? Are the ads you see are going to be different? There are lots of systems, surveillance-based systems, that because a bunch of white guys designed them, they're never tested on anybody else. So there are voice recognition systems that can handle higher pitched voices. There are face recognition systems that can handle darker faces, and these have serious effects. I'm teaching at Harvard. Harvard doesn't do this. Many universities have this remote proctoring software, which is surveillance-based software designed to make sure that you're not cheating in a test, except it doesn't work at all, and it's horribly biased. And this is a concern. I don't care at the consumer level, at the human level, at the citizen level, at the society level, it's a concern. And I think our focus on the market really hurts us here.
Tom, any thoughts on sort of how you're thinking about these questions of bias?
I agree with Bruce. I would add to that even if it's not inherently biased, we need to make sure that people believe that it's still the right way to think about it. Let me give you an example. So we use some information out of a credit file to tell how risky a driver you are. And people are like, well, if I got a crappy credit rating, like, why am I a crappy driver? And our answer has been, I don't know. All I know is like, when you look at the data, it's true. But then you start to say, well, wait a minute, like, is there any racial bias? And there's really, you can show there's no racial bias. That said, we're thinking about how do we move away from this because people just don't understand it. And now what I can do is, back to your, we can, from your cell phone, we can tell how you're driving, where you're driving, how fast you're driving, how much you drive. And so then people get that. So I think there is something to what, and I don't know how the philosophy of people in a democratic society need to embrace the change, and we need to help them see how this benefits them. And when it's not clear, then we should probably use some other data.
It's interesting. In the insurance industry, the data has to be good, but it can't be great, right? If the data was perfect, you wouldn't have an insurance industry. The whole idea is we're going to mix people into different pools, and the pools are pretty big, so we can pay off when a bad thing happens. If I know exactly when you're going to get into a car accident, it's not really insurance, it's prepay. So there's really, you're walking a fine line with insurance data of what's too much data and what's too little data.
Well, but no matter what data we have, we can't predict the future. So that, like that part, we can't.
You haven't seen the movie then, have you?
If we could, I'll let you know.
Well, so for us, we did a project, actually, one of our fellows at the Aspen Tech Policy Hub actually looked at mortgage rates and how difficult it was to get a mortgage, and uncovered that, for instance, women are less likely to be approved for a mortgage, but are more likely to actually pay the mortgage back on time. So there's unique opportunities there in which depending on how you're measuring the data and depending on how you're interpreting the algorithms, you end up with really counterintuitive results. And so I hope with both of you that we can work to try to find some solutions that actually lead to, if the data is going to be used, that it's used in an equitable way.
Even weirder, there are different and contradictory definitions of fairness. And there's good essays on the internet on this. Just search for definitions of fairness.
We actually have a document that goes through 5 different types of fairness and how they can lead to different outcomes. So,
and that's really interesting. So that's us as society deciding, what do we mean by fair?
And not everybody agrees, which is actually right. So I do want to make sure we get to talk a little bit about identity protection, because this is something that a lot of citizens will be concerned about. The number of emails that I've received lately saying your data has been stolen by X, Y, and Z, sign up for blank's credit reporting system that may or may not have lost your data 3 years before. You feel like you're in an endless circle of losing data, getting support, and then having them lose your data again. What should citizens be thinking about in terms of identity protection? Is there any hope anymore?
I can do that. So right now, the security is out of your hands, right? Your data is being held by companies that you have no control over what they do with it. Allstate's one of them, but Facebook, Google, the credit bureaus, the hotels, the airlines, your phone company, that's where your data is. It's not on your computer. It's not on your phone. It's in other people's computers. And you have no control over how they secure it, or even often knowledge of what they have. The solutions here have to be policy-based. And if you want to do something, call your congressperson. There's nothing you can do on your phone to make a difference because it's not on your phone anymore. And that changed in the past 10 years. Your data used to be on your stuff. Now it's on someone else's stuff. It's in the cloud. And the cloud is code for somebody else's computer.
Well, and in fact, all the data now is so specific that with device ID, we can link it together at the household. So we can deliver an ad to you if you're downstairs, if your husband is upstairs looking at cars on some cars.com, because we have the devices mesh. It is, and so I think there does need to be new regulation over it. I do think giving consumers more information to help them make better choices, because there'll be some people that say they gave it up anyway, so they don't really care. And that's, maybe 20% of the people don't care. Everybody else does care. I think the other thing we could do is when a company gets hacked, there needs to be different standards. So giving people credit reporting is like nothing, right? So if your stuff gets hacked, they're going to file unemployment claims. They're going to file a false tax return. Forget your credit card at this point. like you need protection for your entire ecosystem. And so I think if a company gets hacked, it should be forced to give people complete identity protection, not just, hey, I'll do credit monitoring. Because the reality is most people don't sign up for the credit monitoring because they know it doesn't really make that much difference.
Well, and it's being offered by Experian, which was hacked themselves, not too long before. So you're kind of like, wait, I want to give my data back over to the company that lost it in the first place? Go ahead, Bruce.
And I mean, this is also, falls on the IRS. I mean, why should it be that anybody can file a tax return in my name? That seems like a dumb system. Who invented that? And yet, that's where we are.
Well, the IRS is talented at making us all frustrated, so I think that's just the tip of the iceberg there. But so let's talk a little bit. We're about to get to questions, by the way, so if you haven't already, please feel free to throw some questions out there. As you can see, we're a pretty engaged group, so don't hold back. But I want to ask about the future. So we've talked a lot about what the state of the art is for today. What do you see of the future for consumer data privacy protection? Do you think we will accomplish the things that Tom is talking about that Bruce, you've suggested? Or do you think we're going to see more of the same? Maybe I'll kick it over to Tom first.
I'll start with, I think we need to, and I think we need to start now. I don't think we know all the answers. And I think we're kind of waiting for the Holy Grail, but we need to start making legislative and business practice changes now, because if we don't, we're going to start to lose consumers, and we lose consumers, we could lose the whole ball of wax. In other places, we're at the lead in America, and if you look at what I think Europe's doing, they're restricting use of data. I don't think that's the only answer. And you look at what China is doing, they're using it for state purposes. I think America, we have to lead, but we need to do it differently. If you said, do I think we can get it done now? You're asking me, do I think Congress can work? I don't know. Good luck with that one.
Bruce, any more optimism?
So near term, I agree with Tom. I mean, the lobbying money against any regulation is so great, and Congress is so dysfunctional that you won't see anything. I mean, really, I'm looking in two places. I'm looking to Europe. I mean, Europe is the regulatory superpower on the planet right now. And they have privacy regulations that are real, and they're putting together more of them. In the US, I'm looking towards the states, specifically New York, Massachusetts, California. California has a comprehensive data privacy law. They passed another one last year. I mean, New York is regulating cryptocurrencies. And that's where the action is happening. And I think we need regulation. And the thing that Europe has, which really makes it all work, is a private right of action. If you don't have the ability for consumers to take companies to court, you're relying on government enforcement. And that seems to work pretty lousily. So putting that in, companies hate this. They really want no ability for consumers, for victims to sue. Banning that makes a huge difference.
I think the suit part is you just in-state, with a combination of those two, that being the states and the right to sue, leads to a huge trial bar advantage, and that's what business doesn't like. And I think you could accomplish the same thing with federal legislation and with standardized agreements and transferring ownership. I think you'd get the same thing. The problem with the state stuff is we're regulated in 50 different states, and you have to do it 50 different ways, which means you can't share information across states, which means we don't have a U.S. digital economy. We have a Massachusetts one, we have a New York one, and I think that's a problem. I think that's why Congress should act. Like if they don't do it, Bruce is right. Colorado, New Jersey's looking at it, California did one, Massachusetts,
Georgia.
You're gonna get 50 different flavors of ice cream, and it's not going to taste good.
So I'm okay with that. You're not going to like the taste, but I think we will. So I'm actually okay with there being my problem with the federal regulation is it'll be lobbied to uselessness. In states, we have a chance of doing it right. And a good regulation in California, you're going to implement everywhere. Just like a lot of companies implemented GDPR worldwide because it was easier to figure out who a European is. A good regulation, a big enough market, moves the entire world.
Yeah, I'm just concerned that just fixing this by restricting data will stop some of those good benefits that we get from sharing data. And that's why I think We just need the voice of the consumer in here, like not just the voice of the government. I think the government should do more, but I think we got to turn consumers loose. Like, let's educate them. Let's make it easy for them.
Well, so this actually feeds perfectly into our first audience question, which is, what are your insights as to how consumers feel about how their data is being used by companies? What does research tell us that they want? Any thoughts or evidence on that front?
The best data comes from Pew Research, which is where what I said in the beginning, that people do want privacy. They think they have more than they actually have, which is interesting, and they also feel powerless. They feel powerless to make any choices. And there's a lot of good data from Pew, and if you Google it, you'll find it. Of course,
yeah,
so you have to deal with that.
Yeah, Bruce is right. The numbers are like 80% think the risks are greater than the benefits. 60% are trapped. Yeah, it's off the charts. Like if you were looking at your customer sat scores as a digital economy, you'd throw up. You'd be like, oh, everybody hates me.
Well, so and a follow-up was, how much money do companies get each time they collect data? Does certain types of data generate more income? Can we even parse it that way at all, such that we can measure the effects of data collection? Bruce, you seem like you have something here.
It's really hard. I mean, the companies are very opaque about this. They don't talk about details. I mean, we know Google search terms, how much they cost to buy, because those are open markets. You can go on Facebook as an actual Facebook customer, not a user, but a customer, and buy ads, and you'll know you have some idea of how much that costs you. It is very hard to get a handle on this economy. It is mostly under the table. Even state law, Vermont tried to pass a law getting data brokers to register. Who are you and what are you collecting? That's it. And that law was really fought. So it's hard to know the details of this economy. It is very opaque deliberately.
I think I don't think you can tell, because there's no market. There's no way there is no market price on my data because it's free. So that's why I think if you give me ownership for it, I'll decide whether it's worth.
Yeah, but
there's a market though.
Worth a buck of money.
There's an aftermarket. You said you buy data, so
exactly.
You have a price that you pay for data. So it's free to collect, but there is an aftermarket for it. I want to see this on companies' balance sheets. I think that would be awesome.
Yeah, well, there's, it'd be interesting if you viewed it as an asset. It'd be hard to figure out what it's an intangible, obviously. But I think it's sort of like, if apples are free, what's an apple worth? I don't know. An apple pie might be worth some amount of money, but I think if you really want to know how much your individual data is worth, what are you contributing, then you have to have the right to buy and sell it, and it's yours. I mean, it's no different than painting a picture or writing a book. I mean, Bruce, if you wrote 14 books and I decided I was going to copy them all and put my name on it, that's not fair. Why should I be able to take your digital profile and say that that's mine? Like, I just don't think that should be ours.
Well, so another interesting question from the Q&A. We've talked a lot about Congress, what they're going to do, what they're not going to do. This person asked, do you think Congress actually understands technology and personal data issues well enough to legislate on it? And I have to say, this is a concern that I have as well. Legislation is really messy. It's broad. Even if Congress could get together to work on these topics, would we be happy with what came out?
Well, I'll take a shot, Bruce. So first, I think in many of these situations, Congress can't and doesn't know all the specific details of it. So what they do is they bring experts in and then set up a construct to go forward. I think because this is so new and it's changing, there certainly is a knowledge gap. So I think what we need to do is think about this as a 10-year change. So like, not what's the one final bill that's going to put Google and Facebook on equal footing with some startup or that kind of stuff. Think about it as like a 10-year effort. And I would think you have a couple of ways to do it. You can define the data, right? You can give consumers a stronger voice and more knowledge. You can figure out what you should do about the antitrust laws. There's probably 5 or 6 pieces, but I would just start with something now. And I think Bruce really hit on it. It's easier to kill a bill in Washington than it is to get something done.
Bruce?
I think Tom said it right. This is going to be hard. It's going to be iterative, and in general, legislators don't understand the things they legislate. They're not experts in, I don't know, food safety and aviation reliability and employment. They get experts. Right now, experts means lobbyists, and that's a problem. But again, this is how we do it, right? The market is how we act individually as consumers. Government is how we act collectively as citizens. And we need more of the latter here. Because what we're seeing is what happens when the market unfettered has their say. We're basically organizing society for the short-term benefit of a couple of tech billionaires, which is like a dumb way to run the world. But it seems like what we've got. And I want some more deliberate and deliberative systems in place.
Well, two quick points on that. So first, I think a lot will actually happen, not just in legislation, but in any regulation that comes out of it. The devil is in the details. And if we focus only on the legislation and not how the regulatory exchange will happen, you're going to miss a lot of what will really affect folks on the ground. And then I think you make a great point about the influence of lobbyists. And it's one reason a program like ours to train technologists and scientists to go into government can really help, because if you bring the expertise directly to policy, then they wouldn't need to solely rely on sort of external advocates to understand these issues. So
the phrase I want your audience to know is public interest technology. This is what you're doing, and this is important, right? We need technologists who are working in the public interest. What you're doing is absolutely vital. Not just this. Every one of the major policy issues of our century will have strong tech components.
That it could not be further from the truth. So let me turn to another question from the audience. What do you think is the correct balance between progressing digital identity systems that make e-commerce and government easier and maintaining consumer privacy and safety? So between digital identity and consumer privacy and safety, what's the right balance?
You want to
Stumper?
start?
I'll go to Bruce since Tom had to start the last one.
The balance is very context dependent. There's never one answer. So let's take, Google Maps, right? Surveillance-based app. Now, the balance is actually pretty interesting because the data is only useful like for the next 10 minutes and then in aggregate. So we can design something that is really privacy preserving and still have all the benefits of Google Maps. Something like a medical database, which is incredibly personal, probably has to have all the data. And you can't anonymize it. You can't sample it. You need everything. And other applications are going to be in different places. You can't have one answer. It depends what the data is, how it's being used, what its value is, how personal it is, and then the solutions will be tailored. The solution I create for Google Maps is not going to be a solution I create for the giant medical database of the entire United States. It can't be.
Reactions?
Bruce answered it from a system standpoint, and I agree with that. I would answer it from an individual standpoint, and I would say it's right for whatever you want as an individual. And if we give you standardized data sharing agreements, you actually know what you're agreeing to. And so it's got to be simple. It's got to be like 3 or 4 of them, not 11,000 different things that take me forever to read. So simple, give you simple understanding what you agree to, and give you the right to opt out with control, owning your data. Then I think you have 300 plus million Americans who each get to decide what they want, and that gives us the best societal outcome. I just believe we need more individual voices in the digital economy.
So the next question focuses on the fact that many services are not available until you give data. And I think Kashmir Hill did a wonderful piece a couple years ago where she tried to actually get rid of the big 5 tech companies, and legitimately her phone couldn't do anything because of AWS and some of the connections to different systems. So this questioner asks, what do you think of a right to service approach to managing consumer internet use? Are there some systems that you should have the right to use even if you're not willing to give data?
So this is interesting, right? This is the question, has the internet become infrastructure? Has it become like power and like water? Right? Is it something that we as society want to say you have a right to email to communication, I mean,
to Google. Do you have a right to Google something? To search?
The right to search, right? The right to competent search. You know, we can make these arguments that these things are now essential to society, and they need to be treated more like utilities than like your conventional, profit-making corporation. This is a complicated conversation. I don't think we could do it here, but definitely worth thinking about.
Yeah, I think I would say that, the internet's clearly infrastructure. Access to the internet, called Google, Bing, or the other things out there, may not be infrastructure. And the problem is there's very few doors for us to go through. And that's why I think people are after the antitrust stuff. But I don't think the antitrust laws are going to stop that. Like I just looking at the data, the power of the data, really want to compete. Like I think you might be able to take a little bit of the edge off, but you're not going to get this, what people are talking about, right to service. So that's where I'm back to, the government can do a little bit, turn people loose on it. Make Google pay me if I only use, or if I'm a high user and they learn a lot for them, let them figure out how much I'm worth. And maybe I'm worth nothing, and then I get nothing. And maybe there are probably some power users. Bruce probably not a lot. Bruce would be a power user. They may pay him $100 a month.
I'm not convinced I'm worth that much. And the value is not individual. The value is an aggregate. I mean, there's a reason why Facebook doesn't offer a ad-free premium service, because that would just basically skim off all their best prospects into this non-ad service, and they're left with like lousy customers who don't buy much because they're trying to sell to advertisers. So they want to keep things together. They don't want there to be that kind of differentiation.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. I understand like subsidization in insurance. Like I understand how that works. This would force them to get rid of that. And they would, their whole business model would change.
And Tom, how would it change your business model, I guess? Does it materially affect the way that you engage with data?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, for sure. So on the customers we work with who buy DriveWise, who we track them, there's a couple million of them, wouldn't change at all, because they would say, I'm giving you my data and I know I'm getting the price. The other 24 million cars that we track, there is benefit. So like we have our SDKs embedded in a bunch of different apps. And, like there's a 16-year-old kid a couple of months ago who got in an accident in a rural area. We let his mother and sister know, and they rescued him, and he lived. That's the benefit Bruce is talking about, like having all that data. It would change with them. I don't know. Maybe we'd have to start charging to have our app instead of embedding it and us going and try to sell the data on the other side. It would definitely change, but I think it would be a better economy. This is not just about what's good for Allstate today. It's like, we're winning this game in America. If we don't change, we're going to lose.
It's a great point. So we're almost out of time. So I want to move to my final question, which is the bumper sticker question. So I always like to conclude panels with, what is your one bumper sticker short phrase that you hope that the audience will take away from this? So Bruce, what's your bumper sticker?
That this is a policy issue, not a tech issue. And if you don't like the way things are, it's because of the policy choices, and that's where you go to fix them.
Great. Tom, what about you?
Own your data, simple access, and act now. Maybe that's 3 bumper stickers.
Yeah,
sorry.
Tom's got a few bumper stickers on his car. And for me, I actually thought that Bruce's point is that it's about citizens, not just consumers. So we sometimes get locked in to thinking about things just from a business perspective, but there's a human perspective too, and we need to make sure we take that into account as well. So on behalf of the Aspen Ideas Festival, I'd like to thank you all for being here. Thanks to Tom and Bruce for taking the time. And we hope you all go check and see how your phone is tracking you. Thanks again and have a wonderful afternoon.